All right, here's our slope and graphing review. Now, these problems will vary just a little bit from what you see on your review and from what you see on your test, but overall, the questions should look very much similar, just with different numbers. Same format and everything. So let's go ahead and get started. Question number 1 is going to ask you to determine for each line whether the slope is positive, negative, 0, or undefined. So one of the big concepts in this unit is slope, and I want you to be able to decide positive, negative, 0, or undefined. So as I go through this graph, line number 1 is straight up and down. Okay, that is undefined. Okay, my slope is not positive, my slope is not negative, my slope is not flat, saying it's not positive or negative. Straight up and down is undefined. Line number 2, you can see my line is flat, so it's in between a positive and a negative slope, so its slope is 0. This next graph, as I read it, remember you always go left to right. So this graph is going down, and if graphs go down, it's negative, and if graphs go up, it's positive. So this graph is negative. And the line number 4, as I go left to right, meaning across the page like I would read a book, it's going up. Because it's going up, it is a positive slope. All right. So the next question is going to ask you to find the slope from 2 dots. Remember, to find slope, you always need to write your slope as a fraction. So I'm going to start with this fraction bar. And I'm just going to remind you, slope is the rise over the run. So how far up and or down did you go versus how far right or left did you go? So remember, to find slope, I'm going to go along my line from left to right like I'm reading a book until I come across my first point. So going from point 1 to point 2, do I need to move up or do I need to move down? Well, to get to 2, I need to go lower. So I'm going to count down 1, 2, 3 spaces until I'm level with point 2. So on the top of my fraction, I'm going to put a 3 for the 3 spaces that I moved, and I'm going to put a negative for moving down 3. I'm going to go back to where I left off, and I'm going to count the spaces on the run. So 1, 2 spaces. So I'm going to put a 2 on the bottom because I moved 2 spaces, and this is a positive 2. I'm going to make sure my slope is simplified, so negative 3 over 2 would be my simplified slope. I don't need to write the plus sign in the denominator. All right, let's check a different example. So if I want to find the slope of this graph, I'm moving across the page like I'm reading a book, left to right. Here's point 1, and here's point 2. So I'm going to go to my dot. Do I want to move up or down? Up. So I'm going to count spaces 1, 2, 3 spaces up. So there's my fraction bar. Slope is always written as a fraction. 3 goes on top. It was up, so it's positive. Now let's go back to where we left off and count our run. So 1 space, 2 space, 3 space, 4 space, 5 spaces. So I'm going to put a 5 in the denominator for my run, and because it moved to the right, it's a positive direction. And the last thing I'm going to do is simplify. 3 over 5 doesn't simplify, but I can get rid of the plus signs. So my answer would be 3 over 5. All right, let's find slope that passes through the points -7, and -3, 6. All right, so 2 options. I could graph this and count my spaces like I did on the last few problems. But sometimes my drawing skills aren't perfect and I get them in slightly the wrong place. So how do I find a slope from 2 points without a graph? I'm going to use the slope formula. All right, I'm going to use the slope formula. So the slope formula says y2 minus y1 over x2 minus x1. And yes, this is a fraction bar. Okay, we've got our subtraction signs. So let's go ahead and go to our points. Well, what do all these x's and y's stand for? They represent the parts of my ordered pairs. Remember, in a point, the first coordinate part of the coordinate is x, the second part is y. And because these come from my first point, I put a little 1 with the x and the y. This is another x and this is another y, but these come from my second point, so I add a little subscript of 2. Now, how do I use my slope formula? I make my big fraction, I put my subtraction sign on top and bottom, and now I'm going to fill in those spaces. It says y2, so I go to y2, 6. It says minus y1, so I write down y1, which is -7. Now I'm going to make sure I include the minus sign and the -7 in that. Otherwise, it's going to we're going to incorrectly count our spaces. Then the bottom part of the fraction says -3, so I type I write in a -3. X1 is -7, so again, I keep the minus sign and the -7. To simplify, if I were to simplify this by hand, I would, subtracting a negative is like adding, and I would just type that into my calculator. Or you can literally type 6 minus -7 in, and -3 minus -7. But 6 plus 7 is 13, and -3 plus 7 is 4. So my final answer simplifies to 13/4. And no, I don't change it to a mixed number. Slope is a fraction of rise over run, and I don't want a whole number and then my rise and my run. I just need my rise and my run. All right. Okay, so these next two questions, a similar thing. So I'm going to write my slope formula again. y2 minus y1 over x2 minus x1. Let's label our points. xy, first point. xy, second point. Let's use our slope formula. -6 minus a -6, 2 minus -8. I simplify. When I type this in my calculator or simplify in my head, I should get 0 on top and 10 on bottom. Now, let's not leave our answer like this. Let's simplify. So in my calculator, I type in 0 divided by 10. And what does that simplify to? 0. Question number 2, let's go ahead and answer that. I should have xy first point, xy second point, and insert my numbers. -8 minus 1 on top, and 6 minus 6 on bottom. -8 minus 1 is -9, and in the denominator I have 0. Again, I'm going to type that into my calculator. If you type it into Desmos, -9 divided by 0, you can see that my answer says undefined. So when I have 0 on top, my slope is 0. When 0 is in the denominator, it is undefined. So make sure you're paying attention to where that 0 is, because that will affect your answer. All right, this one says to graph the line with a slope of 6 and a y-intercept of -9. So on your assignment, you're going to have a little graph. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. All right, it's going to be the full grid and everything, but for this assignment, for this video, you can kind of follow along. So what does it ask me to do? It asked me to graph with a slope of 6 and a y-intercept of -9. Remember that slope is the steepness. And so 6 is the steepness of the line, but where does that line go on my graph? Does it go way up high? Does it go way down low? How do I know where that goes? The y-intercept is telling me where my graph is located, and the slope tells me how steep it is. Now notice it says y-intercept, so I'm going to go to the y-axis, so this line right here, and I'm going to go down to -9. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 is my y-intercept, and my slope is 6. That's my steepness. Now that's a fairly steep slope. What does that mean? I'm going to go up 6 and over 1. Remember, whole number slopes always need to be turned into fractions, over 1. So I'm going to go to that red dot that I just made, my starting point, and I'm going to use that slope to get to my next point. So 1, and count spaces, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and over 1. And there's my second dot, and I can connect those dots to make my graph. So let's look at another similar graph. So here's my x and y axis. Now if I'm graphing this one, it's already in slope-intercept form. But remember, when there's no constant or there's no plus or minus anything, I still need a starting point. I still need a y-intercept. So my y-intercept, when there is no nothing other than just a number and x, is always in the center of my graph. So go ahead and put that dot in the center of your graph. And the number next to x is my slope. So 2 is my slope. That's the steepness of my line. Remember to make it a fraction. Count up 2 and over 1, and there's my dot. That's my graph. All right, let's look at a different one. So my graph says y equals negative 2x minus 4. So I'm going to make my graph. Now remember, for this graph, that it is more than just my number and an x. It does give me a constant. It gives me a tax on this extra number. Remember, that affects where my line is located on the graph, whether it's up high or it's down low. Because this says negative 4, I'm going to go onto my graph and start at the center. I'm going to count down 4, and that's going to be my y-intercept. From there, I am going to use my rise and my run. So how do I find my rise and my run? Remember, that's the number next to x, which is negative 2. But right now I only have a rise, I need a run, so I always make it a fraction, I always put it over 1. So I'm going to go back to this dot, and I'm going to count down 2 spaces, and over 1 space, down 2 for the negative 2, over to the right one for the positive 1, I connect my dots, and there's my line. All right, so graphing this slope, this graph, I mean. Okay, so what am I going to do? Again, I notice there's that number next to x. That tells me the slope or the steepness of my graph. Notice since it's negative, again, it's going to go down somehow. The number by itself is telling me where is it positioned. Is it positioned way up high, in the center, down low? Because it says plus 3, it's saying, okay, go up 3 and make a dot. So there's my starting point. My graph is centered kind of up 3. And then I'm going to use my slope to get to my next point. So negative 2 over 5. Remember, when there's a negative out front, to always put it with the top. So my new slope is negative 2 over positive 5. And I'm going to use that rise in my run. Remember, negative 2 on top means I count down 2 spaces. And 5 on the bottom means I run 5. So to the right, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And I've got my new dot. I connect them. And I'm done. Okay, so take a second, pause the video, and see if you can do this one on your own. All right, so what is this going to look like? Well, I'm going to start by making a graph, and you don't have to on your assignment. It's already pretty much done for you. So what am I going to do? I'm going to find the number next to x. I'm going to say, okay, that's my slope. And I'm going to say the other number is my starting point. It's going to tell me how high or how low. And since it says plus, I'm going to go high instead of low. So it says positive 6, so I'm going to go up my graph 6 spaces. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I'm going to make a dot. And then my slope, which is negative 1 over 4, notice I put the negative with the top, is going to tell me how steep it is. So negative means it's going to go down. And this is pretty close to 0, so I'm thinking it's not going to be super steep. So what is that going to look like? I'm going to count down 1 space and to the right, 1, 2, 3, 4. And there's my line. And you can see it does go down, and it's not super steep. It's kind of shallow since it's a fraction, small fraction. All right, last question. It says, graph the line with a slope of 3 that passes through the point 5, negative 3. So on this problem, instead of giving me my starting point by telling me what my y-intercept is, they're telling me this ordered pair. Now it's important to keep straight that this is the x and this is the y. Sometimes we get in the habit of doing rise over run first, but remember x means I'm going to go side to side and then up and down. So 5 would be to the right 5 and down 3 spaces is going to be my starting point. Okay, so make sure you found your starting point first. Make sure you do the x and then the y, and then make sure you're going to use your slope to get to the next point. It's telling you how steep it is. So 3, remember to turn it into a fraction, 3 over 1. So I'm going to go back to my point, and it's going to tell me to count up 3 spaces, 1, 2, 3, and over 1. Now I have my 2 points, and here's my graph. All right. That is it. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. Your test is going to be tomorrow, and then I hope you have a great break.